Greetings, YouTube. This past weekend, Ander asked me a question about some real-world metals and how they impact the construction of weapons, which got me thinking about fantasy metals and how we use them, what we call them, how we describe them, and fantasy metals that we may have developed for our own games that others may not have heard of, so I'm going to hopefully open up the opportunity for people to share what they've done. Now, the two most common fantasy metals that I have ever heard of are Mithril or Mithril and Adamantine. Now, Mithril is often referred to as true silver, and I almost always describe it as that. In fact, I can't think of a time I didn't. As a bright, shiny silver metal that never tarnishes. It's an interesting question. Is Mithril ferrous, or is it not ferrous? Do you allow it to be rusted non-magically in your campaigns? I imagine that magical rust will affect any kind of metal. And of course it has the characteristics of being very light and also being very strong. And it's often associated with the Elven culture. The other very common fantasy metal is Adamantine, which is supposed to be the top of the top, the hardest, the toughest, the best there is for any kind of weapon or armor that you can imagine. It's often associated with the Dwarven culture. Now, in different campaigns, I've described Adamantine in different ways. At one time, I described it as a lustrous black. In another campaign, it was a dark green, almost black, that had a iridescent sheen like oil on water. But the last time I used it, I described it as being flat black, a substance that almost reflected no light at all. Not quite Fulligan black, but darn close to it. I also have used auriculum, which is a magical metal, often used as part of other items. It's was very rarely ever used by itself. I had it as coins, actually, that had been part of a very ancient culture, and the coins had absorbed magic over time, part of the characteristics of the metal, and then people valued them because of that trait, and then as soon as they were found, they would be incorporated into magic items, so they would cease being coins. And auriculum I described as being a very yellow bronze, and having a weight fairly similar to that. Now, a fantasy metal I used in the past, and I may well use it again at some point in the future, is Elven Bronze. Now, Elven Bronze was invented at the time when the Bronze Age was the norm for that fantasy setting. And the Elves invented a bronze that had almost all the characteristics of standard bronze. You worked it the same, it had the same kind of ductility and strength, but its one big advantage was it weighed half as much. And that's a big difference, because bronze is heavy. Now, because the elves are not what you'd call dynamic in their culture, they never changed their weapon designs. So even though everyone else moved forward and adopted iron and then steel, the elves of this particular culture that I used it, they never did. So they were still using Elven Bronze and using the weapons that had been designed to take best advantage of that type of metal. So short swords, the longest swords, could have probably been fallen into the category of broadswords, kind of leaf blades. I just use longsword damage. Spears, if you needed a two-handed weapon, you'd use a bronze-headed axe or a club studded with bronze. There were no bastard swords, there were no two-handed swords. Glaives were possible, though not all that common. That kind of thing. It was definitely a slight different take. It was very much inspired by the Greco-Roman style of Bronze Age weaponry. So, are there any fantasy metals that you have ever invented for your campaigns? And if so, what are they called? How do you describe them? I'm looking forward to know, and I'm sure that the role-playing community here on YouTube will also be interested.